The planet has never been a kind place. Throughout history, life has handed out calamities with little mercy. Endless wars, plagues that wiped out entire peoples, famines that starved communities, and predators that hunted humans as if we were nothing more than easy prey. And yet, if you step back and look at the long journey of our species, you'll realize something extraordinary. Never before have humans lived with so much comfort as we do now. Electricity, medicine, food in abundance. These are luxuries. But luxuries are the exception, not the rule. For most of our past, life was raw, brutal, and unforgiving. That harshness forged giants. And among those giants stood the Neanderthals. Their bodies were made to endure the merciless cold of the Ice Age. Broad chests, massive bones, powerful muscles. If you saw one today, you might think they had stepped out of a graphic novel. They were strong, tough, and perfectly adapted to an unforgiving world. But they weren't alone. In the frozen landscapes of Ice Age Europe, another kind of human arrived. Not a forgotten species or a mysterious evolutionary cousin, but us, or at least, an early version of us. These were the Cro-Magnon, the first modern humans in Europe. Their discovery in the 19th century was almost accidental. In 1868, French scientists exploring a cave stumbled upon bones and skulls that looked strangely familiar. They named the site Cro-Magnon, and the people buried there soon carried the same name. At first, researchers thought these remains might belong to a completely different species. The bones were too robust, the features too striking. But when compared closely, the similarities with us were undeniable. Cro-Magnon weren't an evolutionary dead end. They were early Homo sapiens, humans in every way that mattered. And they didn't just resemble us, they could have been us. Their skulls were rounded, their posture fully upright, their faces flat with prominent chins and reduced brow ridges. If you traveled back in time and met a Cro-Magnon on a cold European plain, you would have recognized them immediately as human. They might have looked bigger, tougher, maybe even intimidating, but they would not have seemed alien. They were us, just stronger. Because make no mistake, these were not fragile people. The Cro-Magnon were built like action figures come to life. Men often stood taller than 1.80 meters, with some reaching nearly 1.90 meters, heights that rival professional athletes today. Women averaged around 1.63 meters, taller than many women in the modern world. Their bones were large, dense, and wide, giving them immense strength. A Cro-Magnon clavicle, for example, could measure 19 centimeters, about a quarter longer than an average modern human's, giving them a mechanical advantage in swinging weapons or throwing projectiles. If you compared a Cro-Magnon and a modern person of the exact same height, the Cro-Magnon would weigh about 20% more, almost all of it muscle. They were walking fortresses, designed to endure the harshest trials of the Ice Age. And their skeletons prove just how tough they were. Many show signs of serious injuries, skull fractures, spinal damage, infections, that today would mean certain death. But these people survived. They healed. One female skeleton from France had suffered a major skull fracture in life, the kind of blow that could have killed instantly. Yet the bone shows clear signs of healing. She lived on, carrying the scar of survival. The very first Cro-Magnon identified, Cro-Magnon 1, was even more remarkable. His skull bore scars left by a disease that caused cysts and tumors. And yet, he reached old age, surviving long enough to be considered an elder in his community. In a world where life expectancy rarely exceeded 40 years, that was extraordinary. It showed resilience not just of individuals, but of entire communities. They looked after one another, just as Homo erectus had done before them. In the Ice Age, strength was not optional. It was survival. Cro-Magnon hunters specialized in enormous prey, horses, bison, reindeer, wild cattle, and sometimes even woolly mammoths. The frozen remains of animals with spear wounds, cut marks, and shattered bones prove their skill. They didn't just bring down herbivores. Lions, hyenas, and even bears fell to their weapons. The Cro-Magnon were not merely hunters. They were conquerors of the animal kingdom. Their arsenal was impressive. Stone-tipped spears were just the beginning. They used throwing spears, heavy clubs, knives, nets, and perhaps even primitive bows. Propulsors, devices that acted like spear throwers, extended the range and force of their weapons, turning them into lethal hunters. Archaeologists have found specialized tips and handles, showing they tailored their weapons for different prey. But these tools weren't only used against animals. Sometimes, the most dangerous enemy was another human. Skull fractures are common in Cro-Magnon remains. Many of these injuries weren't accidents. They were blows from weapons, aimed with deadly intent. Cro-Magnon II, for example, was a man who lived over 30,000 years ago. His skull shows a crushing blow to the face, likely from a blunt weapon. It didn't kill him immediately, but he never recovered. He died before the bone could heal, probably from internal bleeding. Another skeleton bears a deep cut in the spine, an attack so precise it would have severed circulation to the brain instantly. These weren't random injuries. They were the marks of violence, the scars of conflict. And sometimes, the conflict went further. At Gough's Cave in England, dated to around 15,000 years ago, archaeologists found something truly unsettling. Human skulls had been turned into bowls, their edges carefully shaped for drinking. Other bones bore knife marks, cuts where flesh, tendons, and muscle were stripped away, bones cracked open for marrow. Among the victims were 2 children. This was not simple burial. This was cannibalism. The Cro-Magnon were capable of extraordinary art and culture, but they were also capable of brutal violence. And the Neanderthals, their cousins in Ice Age Europe, learned this firsthand. For decades, scientists debated why the Neanderthals disappeared so soon after the arrival of modern humans. Climate change played a role, but there is evidence that direct conflict also mattered. One Neanderthal skeleton bears a spear wound in the ribs, a projectile weapon that Neanderthals never used but Cro-Magnon did. And a Neanderthal jaw found with cut marks identical to those on butchered deer has led some researchers to an unsettling conclusion. At least once, Neanderthals may have been eaten. Subscribe if you like the video. The relationship between Cro-Magnon and Neanderthals has fascinated scientists for decades. Were they enemies locked in brutal combat, or neighbors who sometimes shared fires, tools, and even families? The truth, as the evidence shows, is complicated. Yes, there are signs of violence. A Neanderthal with a spear wound in his ribs almost certainly fell in battle, struck by a weapon Cro-Magnon used, but Neanderthals did not. And yes, that jawbone with cut marks does suggest cannibalism. But violence was not the whole story. Genetics tells us something even more intimate. Cro-Magnon and Neanderthals mixed. One of the earliest known modern humans in Europe, a man who lived around 40,000 years ago, carried about 9% Neanderthal ancestry. That means his great-grandparent or great-great-grandparent was a Neanderthal. In other words, early Cro-Magnon weren't just fighting Neanderthals, they were also forming families with them. Over time, however, those genetic traces became diluted. Today, non-African populations still carry between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA, faint echoes of those ancient encounters. But if Neanderthals contributed to us, why did they vanish while Cro-Magnon thrived? Part of the answer lies in sheer numbers. Neanderthals lived in small groups, often just a few dozen individuals. Cro-Magnon populations, by contrast, exploded. Archaeological estimates suggest that by 13,000 years ago, over 70,000 Cro-Magnon roamed Europe. In the context of the Ice Age, that was a crowd. Their fertility rates were higher, their survival rates better. Over time, they simply outnumbered the Neanderthals until the latter faded away. Still, numbers alone don't explain dominance. Culture does. Cro-Magnon weren't only hunters and survivors. They were creators. They gave us some of the most extraordinary art of prehistory. Cave walls became canvases for powerful images of lions, horses, mammoths, and bison. At Chauvet Cave in France, painted more than 30,000 years ago, the artistry is astonishing. Fluid lines, shading, and perspective that rival much later works. At Lascaux, discovered by accident in 1940, hundreds of animals gallop across the walls in breathtaking scenes of movement and power. Art wasn't limited to caves. Cro-Magnon made small sculptures too, most famously the Venus figurines. These small carvings of women, often with exaggerated hips and breasts, have been found from Spain to Siberia. Their purpose is debated. Fertility charms, religious icons, or symbols of beauty. Whatever the answer, They reveal a people capable of symbolism, imagination, and abstract thought. They also decorated themselves. Red ochre pigments, beads made from shells and bones, pendants, and even bracelets have been found at Cro-Magnon sites. Some had tattoos or body paint. These weren't luxuries, they were statements. Identity, status, and belonging were expressed through art and adornment. In a world where survival was everything, Cro-Magnon still found time for beauty. And then there was music. Archaeologists have uncovered flutes carved from bird bones, dating back more than 35,000 years. These instruments could produce complex melodies, not just simple sounds. Alongside drums, whistles, and possibly stringed instruments, music became part of Cro-Magnon life. Imagine sitting in a mammoth bone hut as the wind howled outside, while inside, flames crackled and someone played a flute. These were not people merely surviving, they were living. Their technology also set them apart. Where Neanderthals relied mostly on thrusting spears, Cro-Magnon developed throwing spears, atlatls, spear throwers, and perhaps the earliest bows. Their toolkit included finely crafted blades, scrapers, needles, and points. Bone and antler were shaped into tools with precision, showing an ability to adapt materials to specific needs. They hunted smarter, not just harder. Even their hunting strategies reflected intelligence. Cro-Magnon organized game drives, herding animals into narrow valleys, cliffs, or traps. Evidence shows they built large-scale hunting structures, using cooperation and planning to take down entire groups of animals at once. This efficiency meant more food, more security, and more growth for their populations. But their diet was not limited to meat. They consumed an astonishing variety of plants, over 150 species of seeds, nuts, roots, and fruits. Grinding stones found at Cro-Magnon sites contain traces of starch, showing they processed plants into flour-like substances. This dietary diversity gave them resilience. When big game was scarce, they had alternatives. Perhaps their greatest partnership, however, was with another species, the dog. Bones of early domesticated dogs, dating back more than 36,000 years, have been found at Cro-Magnon sites. By 15,000 years ago, dogs were clearly companions, even buried alongside humans. This bond gave Cro-Magnon an advantage. Dogs helped track prey, guard camps, and provide warmth. It was a relationship that shaped both species forever. Their homes were just as remarkable. Cro-Magnon sometimes sheltered in caves, but they also built huts, often from mammoth bones and tusks covered with hides and grass. Some of these structures contained separate areas for cooking, sleeping, and working. Fireplaces were built inside for warmth and light. Far from crude shelters, these were organized spaces, reflecting a sense of community and planning. Their societies were not isolated. Trade networks stretched across Europe, linking groups hundreds of kilometers apart. Materials like obsidian, seashells, and ivory traveled vast distances, exchanged not just for survival but also for symbolic purposes. This connectivity made their culture dynamic and resilient, allowing them to share ideas, technologies, and traditions across wide regions. Cro-Magnon also endured one of the harshest periods in history, the last glacial maximum. Ice sheets advanced, forests shrank, and habitats collapsed. Yet, unlike Neanderthals, they adapted. Seasonal camps, varied diets, wide trade networks, and social bonds kept them alive. They not only endured the Ice Age, they flourished in it. And perhaps this is why the Neanderthals disappeared. Cro-Magnon didn't just survive, they multiplied. Their population grew rapidly, their societies expanded, and their culture thrived. Neanderthals, with smaller numbers and fewer innovations, simply couldn't keep up. Within a few thousand years of Cro-Magnon's arrival in Europe, Neanderthals were gone. But the story of Cro-Magnon doesn't end there. They didn't vanish like Neanderthals. They transformed. Over thousands of years, they became us. Modern Europeans carry their genetic legacy, their culture echoes in our art and music, and their resilience paved the way for the rise of civilizations. The Cro-Magnon story is not just about survival. It is about transformation. These people, who walked the frozen plains of Ice Age Europe, were not a separate species destined to vanish like the Neanderthals. They were us. Over thousands of years, their culture, their bodies, and their genes flowed directly into modern humanity. But before we reach that conclusion, we need to look at how they lived during their final millennia, because their world was far from stable. The last glacial maximum pushed the climate to extremes. Ice sheets stretched deep into Europe, squeezing habitable land into smaller pockets. Food sources shrank, habitats vanished, and the pressure on human communities intensified. Yet Cro-Magnon did not break. They adapted. Archaeological evidence shows they built increasingly sophisticated camps. Some were temporary, designed to follow migrating herds. Others were long-term settlements, carefully organized with separate spaces for cooking, sleeping, tool-making, and communal fires. Inside mammoth bone huts, lined with hides and grass, families survived months of bitter cold. They placed hearths at the center of these shelters, turning them into warm islands of life amid the ice. Even as the world outside grew harsher, Cro-Magnon societies grew richer in culture. Their art reached its peak during this period. The Magdalenian culture, flourishing between 17 and 12,000 years ago, produced some of the most breathtaking cave art ever found. At sites like Altamira in Spain, polychrome bison leap across ceilings with such realism that they still stun visitors today. Jewelry became more elaborate, clothing more decorated, and musical instruments more refined. In a time when survival should have left no room for luxury, Cro-Magnon created beauty. This combination of resilience and creativity explains their demographic explosion. While Neanderthals dwindled, Cro-Magnon numbers multiplied. Some estimates suggest the population of Europe increased tenfold under their presence. By the end of the Ice Age, Cro-Magnon were everywhere, while Neanderthals had disappeared. But how exactly did the Neanderthals vanish? The answer, as always, is layered. Climate change eroded their habitats, shrinking their hunting grounds. Low population density made them vulnerable to inbreeding and disease. Cro-Magnon competition for resources put further strain on them, and interbreeding diluted their identity into ours. By 30,000 years ago, Neanderthals were gone as a distinct species, leaving only traces of their DNA within us. Cro-Magnon, meanwhile, continued to adapt. Their robust frames gradually slimmed down as diets diversified and lifestyles shifted. The heavy brow ridges and large jaws softened, yet their cranial capacity remained impressive, often larger than ours today. On average, Cro-Magnon brains measured around 1,500 cubic centimeters, compared to 1,350 in modern humans. What that meant in terms of cognition is still debated, but clearly they were intelligent, innovative, and deeply capable. Their social networks also expanded. Trade routes linked groups across continents. Seashells from distant coasts, obsidian from volcanic regions, and ivory from faraway herds traveled hundreds of kilometers. These exchanges weren't just practical, they were cultural. They carried ideas, styles, and symbols. The Cro-Magnon world was becoming interconnected long before cities or nations existed. And in that web of exchange, something else emerged: identity. Body paint, tattoos, jewelry, clothing, all pointed to a growing sense of self-expression. These weren't just tools for survival, they were tools for meaning. A painted body, a decorated spear, a carved figurine. These things told stories about who someone was, what they believed, and what their place in the group might be. It's tempting to imagine that the Cro-Magnon were simply more ruthless than the Neanderthals, that they devoured them literally and figuratively. And in part, that may be true. The evidence of conflict, cannibalism, and technological superiority suggests they had the edge. But their triumph wasn't just about violence. It was about adaptability. Cro-Magnon could live in caves, huts, or tents. They could hunt mammoths or fish rivers. They could survive famine with nuts, seeds, and roots when big game was scarce. Their resilience was the key to their dominance. And eventually, Cro-Magnon ceased to be Cro-Magnon. By around 10,000 years ago, as the Ice Age ended, these early Europeans transitioned seamlessly into the populations we now recognize as modern humans. Their cultures evolved into the Mesolithic and Neolithic, laying the foundations for farming, villages, and civilization itself. They didn't disappear, they became us. Their legacy remains in our genes. Modern Europeans still carry traces of Cro-Magnon ancestry, just as they carry traces of Neanderthal DNA. Their art remains on cave walls, their tools in the ground, their bones in museums. Their music echoes in the flutes carved from bird bones, still capable of playing haunting notes. Their spirit lives on in our resilience, our creativity, and our contradictions. So why call them the humans who devoured the Neanderthals? Because in many ways they did. They consumed their territories, outnumbered their populations, inherited their genes, and perhaps even ate their flesh. But more than that, they absorbed their place in history. When the Neanderthals were gone, Cro-Magnon remained. And from them came us. Their story is not one of extinction, but of transformation. And it is a reminder of something profound. Survival is never guaranteed. Even the strongest, like the Neanderthals, can fall. Even the most enduring, like Homo erectus, can vanish. But those who adapt, who bend without breaking, who innovate without forgetting, those are the ones who shape the future. We are the heirs of Cro-Magnon. Their strength, their creativity, their resilience, all of it flows through us. But so too does their fragility, their violence, and their mortality. When we look at their art, we see beauty. When we look at their weapons, we see power. When we look at their bones, we see ourselves. Cro-Magnon were not just the humans who devoured the Neanderthals. They were the humans who became us. And that is the true lesson of their story. Our greatest victories are always written side by side with our darkest shadows. Subscribe if you enjoyed the video.